Welcome to the Great British Foreign Affairs Podcast, hosting insightful conversations with fascinating people to shape the way that Britain interacts with the world. Welcome, Guy. I am so happy to have you on the podcast today, and we are talking about the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. I'd love first for our listeners to get to know you. So please could you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your background and your story.
No, thank you very much, Anna. And I'm delighted to be joining your podcast. I've been listening to it, so I'm really honored to be here. A bit about me. It's always a difficult question when I'm asked, tell me about you, because I've got a little bit of a mixed bag in terms of my background. But let's start by the professional career. My background is digital transformation expert. I started working in a blue chip company in the FTSE 100, focusing on the NHS with workforce transformation. So I went on then to set up a consultancy firm, helping NHS organizations save millions of pounds through better rostering of the workforce, essentially. And my passion for technology, blockchain, and AI led me to start looking at ways to apply the technology in other fields. And obviously, coming from the Congo, I'm originally from the Congo, I started engaging with various stakeholders in the country, which led me to engage in different sectors, most particularly in the critical mineral sectors. Hence my transition in that. And looking at the critical mineral sector, as you can imagine, it's a highly political and geopolitical sector. So that's where the transition from purely advising on technology transitioned into advising on geostrategy and geopolitics. And that led me to add another branch to my business venture, to focus on the relationship between the West and the global South, but obviously the UK particularly and the DRC, working with MPs in the UK, ministers in the UK, as well as the equivalent in the DRC, as well as the private sector. So in a nutshell, that's my professional life. In terms of my background story, a bit again of a milkshake. I was born in Belgium because my parents traveled there for studies. Then I moved back to the DRC, then called Zaire, under President Mobutu, when I was about 4 or 5. So I studied in Zaire. I saw the transition from Zaire into Congo, from Mobutu into Kabila, and all the rest of it. And then I left Congo due to the crisis. As a matter of fact, I left Congo for my own safety. So I left as a refugee. I found my way to the UK. Where I now live, where I'm now a British citizen, where I now contribute to the society. So when we talk about Congo's conflict, Congo economy is really intertwined with my own life and my own experience. But we're going to talk about it as we go through our chat.
Yeah, but I love that, because one of the things I try to do on this podcast is to enable listeners to be able to really connect with somebody who represents what they're talking about, because it's so much easier to understand what's going on in a country when you have a personal reference point, isn't it? And I think you demonstrate that real dual perspective, which is amazing to be able to learn from today. I just want to start by saying that I'm just so pleased that we can cover this topic, because as we all know right now, global affairs is moving extremely rapidly. In fact, foreign affairs as a whole is becoming talked about all the time in Britain, which wasn't always the case. And of course, that means that people are focusing a lot, particularly on the West and on the global order changing. But we also know that there's a lot going on around the world. And what's really important at times like this is that we keep our eye on what is happening on a global stage and we don't miss things. And so today we are diving in to understand a bit more about DRC and what's happening there at the moment, because I know that listeners will have caught that something's going on. They may have read a few things, but I wanted to provide an opportunity for people to really engage in what's happening. But first, give us a chance to get to know the country better. For people that haven't visited, could you paint a picture of DRC, perhaps its geography, culture, what it's known for, or what you particularly love about it?
That's a very, very difficult question, as I say, but I'll try to make it justice. I mean,
Thank you.
DRC is a fascinating country. It's one of the largest country in sub-Saharan Africa, as you know, and second largest to, I think after Algeria. We've got an area of 2,245 square kilometers. It's huge. It's the size of Eastern Europe. It's massive. And with that comes obviously opportunities, but also challenges. But let's focus on the opportunities and on the positive side of that size. It's culturally rich, vibrant population, very innovative. As a matter of fact, when we talk about culture in the DRC, I didn't know that myself, but in 1997, rumba, which is one of the Congolese music, was inscribed into the UNESCO intangible assets. That shows you the scale of the impact of the culture. You've got, contemporary artists rising very, very, very well in terms of the diversity of the cuisine, if I can call it that way. It's so massive because we have 250 tribes. I don't know if it's difficult to comprehend the scale. 250 tribes with their own cuisine, their own languages, and their own mini culture. So the Congo is literally a little bit like the United States. It's just massive. I've been to only 2 of the 26 provinces. We've got the equatorial line crossing the country, which means that you've got all of the seasons almost in the DRC. Again, growing up, I didn't know, but there's snow and people are skiing in the DRC. Yet it's a tropical country.
Wow.
You see? You've got the Congo River crossing the country. Congo River is the second powerful river in the world, and the deepest actually, with 220 meters deep in some parts. Again, huge. I mean, I can talk about Congo for days without stopping. It's almost, where do you stop? Where do you start? But yes, so that's what I can say about Congo. It's really a very good country worth visiting. But obviously, sad things happening at the same time.
Yeah, I love the fact you mentioned the music, because the music is known and respected continent-wide, isn't it? I remember sitting in various cafes and hotels and whatever in West Africa and hearing Congolese music.
Yes, indeed. But if I may add, obviously Congo is known for its music. I would like to say, unfortunately, because Congo is so much more. When you look at the biodiversity, you've got some unique species that you can only find in Congo. The most famous one is the okapi or the bonobos. They're only in Congo. But yes, that's something hopefully people will get to discover as we talk and as they get more interested into the country.
And tell us about the role and the place it plays in the region and on the continent.
Well, given its size, when you look at it, Congo has 9 neighbors, 9 altogether. So that's quite useful. That's quite a lot. But at the same time, that creates some issues, because we've got Angola, which is a huge country as a neighbor. You've got Burundi, you've got the Central African Republic, the Republic of Congo. That's quite unique because Republic of Congo's capital, which is Brazzaville, is just opposite Kinshasa, which is the capital of the DRC. And those are the 2 closest capitals in the world. And you can cross the Congo River to go from one side to the other. So that's quite interesting. You've got Rwanda, with, as you know, there are some issues which we're going to talk about. You've got Uganda, Tanzania, and Zambia. So those are, and South Sudan. So managing those relationships is quite tricky. But at the same time, the population in the border of those regions are living together because ultimately they are the same people. So that's one. But 2, that means given the sheer size, the DRC is both on the eastern bloc, but on the southern bloc. And those 2 blocks don't always align culturally, politically, or economically. And that makes Congo at the crossroad of many power play in the region, but also internationally.
Yeah, that's explained so well. Thank you. It's a really interesting description because of where it is right in the middle. The fact that it crosses from the south to the north of the continent and the east and the west. It really is this crossing place. And
Yes.
that's a really good reminder about communities that live near borders, like in many other areas that we've talked about. We've did a podcast, for example, on the Sahel. It's similar. Communities are of the same ethnic origin. They're living together. They're trading together. And that's a really important thing for people to understand.
And there's something I may wish to add, if you allow me.
Please.
When we speak about Congo, we spoke about the culture, we spoke about, the diversity and the biodiversity. There's one thing that is not talked about enough when we talk about Congo. And I will see if I don't mention it. Congo has the second largest rainforest. So essentially, Congo has the second lung of the world after the Amazonian forest. So essentially, when we're talking about the energy transition, the fight against global warming, the CO2 reduction, Congo plays a unique role given the forest that they have.
That's super interesting and really, really great that you've highlighted that. I was also thinking you'll come onto it more and you've referred to it in your professional background, but do you want to say something about the minerals and the resources?
Yes. I mean, that's my bread and butter nowadays. Congo is, you asked me the question about the role of Congo in the region, but as a matter of fact, Congo has a role to play and has been playing a role since the beginning of time in international affairs. Back in the days during the Belgium-Congo ruling, the natural resources were rubber, of which obviously the UK was quite heavily involved in exploiting alongside the Belgian. Today it's no longer rubber, economy evolved, is the critical minerals. The country has been blessed or cursed, depending on how you look at it, with huge mineral deposits. I think the estimate is about 24 trillion value of mineral resources in the country. It's incomprehensible. And that poses a number of issues because when you think about it, many Western powers and Eastern powers are fighting to get access to those minerals, and not only in the best ethical and economically viable way. For instance, Congo has 70% of the world reserve of copper and cobalt, which is needed for the defense application and also all the rest of it. Again, Congo is the number one producer of coltan. Again, used for military applications. But we will talk about that in more details. But again, you've got neighboring countries such as Rwanda, who happen to be number one exporter, without being the number one producer. So that creates some duality, and that explains why the war is going on, and perhaps why the international community is silent about that. But essentially, the conflict that you see in Congo now is essentially about critical mineral. Yes, that's what it is.
Yeah, which leads us perfectly to dive in. I was really interested to ask you to give us an explainer almost, or a potted history of the conflict that the country's experienced, and then to go on to tell us about what's going on right now.
Yes. I mean, when you look at the conflict today in the eastern part of the country, the name that sprang to mind is M23 and Rwanda. That's what people talk about. But in reality, this conflict started from 1994. In 1994, the late Rwandese president's plane was shot down, by the then rebellion led by President Kagame, which people say and experts say that events led to the genocide of the Tutsis, which is a horrendous, very shameful part of the humanity history. I'd say the human history is really, really bad. But as a result of the genocide, the Hutus, who were among the people killing the Tutsis, because a lot of Tutsi were killed, ran away into the DRC. The international community asked the DRC to open the borders to receive the refugees. It was both Hutus and Tutsis. although the Hutus were branded as being the genocide. The issue with that is that you had both the civilians and the armed groups who crossed the borders with the weapon, if you can say so. So fast forward a couple of years, 1997, President Mobutu was sick and on his way out, a rebellion sprang up, and that led to the first war in the region. The Rwandese government claimed that the Hutu run away from the genocide into the DRC were posing a security risk. Okay, understandable. And therefore, Rwanda backed up the very first rebellion led by President Kabila, the father, because there were two President Kabila, but Kabila the father. And therefore, Kabila the father marched into Kinshasa, and President Mobutu had to the capital, crossing the country by foot. Such a big country as well. But that means that rebellion were fully backed by Rwandese. So I was in Kinshasa at the time, and obviously I was not linked, but my father used to work with Mobutu as an economic advisor. So I was in the cycle of the former regime. And therefore against the new power that came in. So Kabila came into power with the Rwandese, and we had James Kabarebe, and that's quite interesting. We had James Kabarebe as the chief of staff of the Congolese army then. Who is James Kabarebe? James Kabarebe has just been sanctioned by the US for his role in the M23 support, and James Kabarebe is still the minister of regional integration of the Rwandese government, and prior to that was the chief of staff of the Rwandese army. Why that is important is because you've got someone who was the chief of staff of the DRC following the rebellion, finding himself chief of staff of the Rwandese army. You couldn't make it up. But the fact that he was the chief of staff of the army, they were in the full control of the Congolese army. They could have dealt, and they actually dealt with the security risk that was posed to Rwanda, if that makes sense. Therefore, as part of the support given to Kabila, the Rwandese regime, the RDF, asked Kabila to give them access to huge mineral wealth. Kabila, being now in power in Kinshasa, says actually this deal don't make sense, and therefore he changed his mind. That led to his killing. Okay, that led to his killing. His son Joseph Kabila took over the power. 18 years of ruling, and since then, throughout his tenure, people say that he was working with the Rwandese because the mineral exploitation continued. But you can understand why people will think that way, and that led to the second war with the M23, again with the Rwandese backing the M23.
At what point was that?
2011, 2012. Yeah, between 10 and 12, I believe. Again, M23 came back in, but then there's a new story with M23. M23 is 23rd of March agreement. The Congolese government signed an agreement with M23 to get them back to get the rebels into the army. But the challenge with that is getting the rebel into the military in senior position. What the Congolese government said, okay, you get into the army, you get mixed up with the Congolese army, but you go to other parts of the country. You don't stay in the eastern part of the country because there is a risk of balkanization. And the Rwandese and the M23 and the CNDP before were mostly from Tutsi origin, which are mostly part of the Rwandese ethnic group. So what we said, okay, we can have Tutsis in the army, but you do not stay in the eastern part. You go on in the west. But one of the call was to remain in that part. Now, what is interesting is that in that region, there is obviously it's mineral rich, but there's one city called Rubaya. Rubaya is a place where coltan is mostly produced. And whenever there was a rebellion, Rubaya always fall. At this very moment, Rubaya is held by the M23. That mine is operating its full steam, generating $800,000 a month, essentially fueling the rebellion and fueling the coffers of the power supporting the M23. So that's where the issue comes in, essentially about minerals. So Kabila sign some agreement with the M23.
Known as the peace agreement, right?
Exactly. But for the war to stop, and that's critical because we're looking for solutions for the war to stop now. For the war to stop, the US imposed sanctions on Rwanda. Not threat, literally sanctioned. The UK also sanctioned Rwanda. Within a couple of weeks, months, the war stopped. It's only now that it's resurrecting again. So we know what to do to stop the war. Just more sanction on Rwanda by most parties. It's coming, but not enough.
So thank you. It's difficult to sum up conflicts like this, and that's a really kind of great explainer. So then tell us in a bit more detail what's been happening recently, particularly since January, right?
Before I say that, if you don't mind,
please.
This war has been going on for 30 years. I ran away from that war. I found myself as a refugee in this country. As I said, many people didn't have that chance. I've got friends killed. And according to experts and NGOs, there are more people dead in Congo than there were in World War II. Yet, not many people are talking about it. I had the opportunity to sit down and chat with the Nobel Prize winner, Dr. Mukwege. You may have heard of him. And the stories it will tell you of the women being raped, because rape is being used as a weapon of war, because there's ethnic cleansing going on, is just so underreported. And that's the sad part of that conflict, is the humanitarian crisis that comes with the security crisis and the economic crisis that's going on there.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting exactly. It's so important that everyone understands the seriousness and the level of the conflict, and also the horrific experiences of civilians as well as soldiers as part of that conflict.
Indeed. And obviously you have many millions of people displaced in their own country. But yeah, so in response to your question about what's going on since January.
Oh, sorry. Should we just touch on what happened in 2019?
Oh, yes.
So power changed in DRC, didn't it?
The president Joseph Kabila obviously was at the end of his second term, allowed by the constitution, tried to stay in power. There are states, there's a huge international pressure, pressure from the population to organize election. Election took place. Whether the best election organized? Probably not, but they took place. And President Tshisekedi was elected the president. Many people talked about the integrity of the election, whether it was rigged or not. The fact is, Tshisekedi was declared the winner. Funny enough, by the current leader of the M23 political arm, Manga, who is a close ally to Joseph Kabila.
And there was quite an interesting moment, wasn't it, as the international community and the other countries surrounding DRC decided whether to welcome and embrace the results of that election.
From what people are saying, is that should someone else be declared the winner, it will have created chaos. And therefore, they had to accept the person who was declared. I wasn't privy to the discussion, the counting, so I can't really comment on who won or who didn't win. But Tshisekedi was elected. But what was good is that there was an electoral or political pact, I would say, between Kabila and Tshisekedi to rule the country. That gave some hope, I'd say, for the future. And again, I'm apolitical when it comes to DRC. In the UK, I'm a conservative, and I have my own issues with my own with the then conservative government, given the support they gave to Rwanda. We're gonna come into that. But regarding the DRC, that political arrangement gave some hope. Fast forward a couple of weeks and months, the relationship between Kabila and Tshisekedi fell off. A new majority was formed, and Tshisekedi actually had more grip and control, I'd say, in the ruling of the part of the country. That created a lot of animosity, if you can imagine. And as I explained before, Kabila, as well as his father, has always been linked to the Rwandese. whether it's verifiable or not, always been linked. And therefore, that started to bubble how can I put it? The dissension that more and more people started to raise against Tshisekedi because naturally they were siding with Kabila. So as the rebellion started to creep up, fingers started to be pointed at the potential role of Joseph Kabila in it, until recently when the President Tshisekedi literally said that Joseph Kabila is behind M23 and everybody else. So that's the situation. In terms of the opposition is not as vibrant as one will expect. And as a matter of fact, the democracy in reality in our country is not as vibrant as it should be. But let me explain what I'm trying to say. In terms of media freedom, today, any journalist can say whatever they want. They can insult the president, which wasn't possible under Kabila's rule. I lived in both sides, so there's definitely more freedom. But the challenge with democracy in the DRC, it's a country of 100 million population. Majority of the population under 15, largely uneducated.
Yeah.
So you give them a T-shirt, they vote for you. You understand what I'm saying? So the political maturity is not there yet. And then one wonders whether democracy, as we know it in the West, is the best model. Because the people who vote for you don't vote because of your political plan, of your manifesto. It's just because you gave them drinks and foods. So that's where we are. So quite young democracy, but that's where we are now.
So coming to January this year, tell us what's happened in the last few months.
The rebel obviously advanced. Goma fell. That was, I'd say, the wake-up call of the international community. Many other villages fell down, and some of them mineral-rich. But Goma is the capital of the eastern part of the country, and is a symbol of the state in a sense. So from the point Goma fell, no one could close their eyes, I can say, if I may. And therefore you saw the international community being a little bit more vocal because they couldn't remain silent. The fall of Goma is highly symbolic. It's for the population, it's a massive blow. And the challenge is a lot of people died in Goma. Fast forward a couple of weeks, Bukavu fell. Bukavu is another massive city. Unfortunately, some of the regional armies, such as army troops from South Africa, 14 of them fell down, which fueled even more exposure to what was happening in the ground. And that's why you start seeing a lot more, I'd say, calling for Rwanda to pull back their troops, more vocal pressure on Rwanda, but also on the DRC to get into the negotiating table. The challenge we have now is that there are two regionally led initiatives. On one side, you've got the Rwanda process being managed by or led by the mediator, President Joao Lorenzo, and you've got the Nairobi process, which is led by President Ruto of Kenya, as well as the former president. The difference between those two processes is that on the Angola-Rwanda process is about meeting with the Rwandese, because this crisis cannot be dealt with only within Congo, because it's rooted from the backing of Rwanda. So you need two levels of negotiation, one with the Rwandese and one with the national players. Now, the M23 has been branded as a terrorist organization. They are definitely rebels terrorizing the population, but they are not only the M23. There are many other rebel groups. And the Nairobi process says that they need to move away from all of the localities and cities that they took. They need to drop their weaponry and then start the negotiating process, because you cannot negotiate and try to get into the civil life and the army life with weapon with you. So on one side, there's a call for the M23 and all the other armed groups, of which there are hundreds, to go back to the negotiating table at the Nairobi process, and Rwanda and the DRC president to meet at the Rwanda process, which is not happening.
And obviously, when you're looking at something like this, there are always things that the experts or the people really in the know are tracking, like the things that would move the needle or that would make a difference. And I wondered, what is it that you're particularly watching at the moment? Or potentially, what are the different scenarios in which it could now play out?
That's a very good question. There are many scenarios and so many that one cannot even preempt. But the first one is the scenario of 2012, where specific individual as well as the regime in Rwanda are sanctioned by the US and the UK and all of the other power players, such as the EU as well. You have to know that Rwanda financial harm, which is Crystal Venture, has been insulated from all of this narrative. If they are sanctioned, I believe the war will stop because they will pull up their troops. That's one, which will weaken the M23. Then if through sanction on the M23, they get them to pull out of the Rubayas region, it will cut off the 800 million a month financial chest, which I believe will cut down we stop the war, I believe, without creating more regional conflicts. Because what you have there is that you've got the SADC region with, Zimbabwe, South Africa. As I said, some South African troops got killed. But you also have the Eastern Bloc with Uganda and Kenya and all the rest of it. Burundi. There's a risk of a mini world war in Congo. We had that before. We called it the Great African World War. There's a risk of having that. So the sanction to me is the best route. But you saw President Kagame saying that he doesn't mind the sanction. He's fighting for his survival, and therefore he will stick to his gun. So it's a bit tricky, but sanction to me is the best way forward. Obviously, second option is the negotiation. But with the negotiation, unless it's done through the different initiative, as I said, Rwanda and Nairobi, it's going to be tricky for negotiation to take place, because you have to consider that you have to consider what M23 is asking for. M23 is asking to have senior posts in the army and to control the eastern part of the Congo, essentially handing over the control of that part to M23. Considering that M23 is backed up by Rwanda, the Congolese president, it will be suicidal for him politically to accept that. Mm-hmm. So it's between a rock and a hard place. He cannot, even if he wanted to, he can't accept that. So that's the second improbable scenario. And I'd say the third scenario, it's a military solution. Now, that military solution is a difficult one to put in place because the Congolese army is very infiltrated by the Rwandese. When I say that, I just say that in 1997, when I was in Kinshasa, the chief of staff was James Kabarebe, a Rwandese. So you can tell that as an army is not yet structured enough, I'd say, to push back the rebellion. Now, you probably saw there's a lot of discussion about critical mineral deal with the US, like what is going on in Ukraine. Let's see how that will play out. As you know, President Trump is a very transactional president, especially in this second term compared to the first. Will President Tshisekedi be able to pull something off? Maybe. And what that will look like in terms of security guarantee, I don't know. But for the US, it will certainly not be as costly in terms of security guarantee than it is for the Ukraine war. But that's another model. So we're keen to see how that will play out. It's worth saying that the overall conflict is an international conflict. We haven't spoken about China. We haven't spoken about Russia. When you look at the critical mineral landscape, it's controlled by the Chinese. Most of the operating mines are controlled by the Chinese. Yes, there are JVs with Congolese governments, but most of the operations, you got Chinese money. Under President Kabila, you had the deal of the century, as they call it, mineral versus infrastructure. Mineral left the country, raw materials are being extracted and sent to China for processing and refinery. The Congo remained poor with no infrastructure. So what the Congolese government is trying to do. As a matter of fact, I'm involved in one of the projects of building the first copper and cobalt refinery. Is a play whereby the Congolese government wants to start creating local beneficiation to add value in country, which opens up opportunity for the UK, for the US, and for the West in general. But the loser of such a model are the Chinese.
Yeah, because the value is added in country. The benefits should, if the contracts are set up right, benefit local communities and the country itself through taxes. But that would mean that the value is added in country.
Exactly that. And that plan was pre the war. Now, one wonders why the war started, because such a plan, imagine if such a plan carries on all the way, even including the mineral in the eastern part of the country, such as coltans. The illicit trade via Rwanda will stop because everything will be done in the country. So that's one of the reasons the war is going on. So as far as the US and the UK and the West in general is concerned, this is a tremendous opportunity for them to help stop the war, come directly to the DRC, engage with DRC officials, but also DRC private sector.
Yeah, and I think I'm really glad that you've touched on that, because it's so important to be looking at the economy, isn't it? And advancement of countries and communities at the same time as looking at other causes of conflict, because they do go hand in hand, don't they? In terms of younger people being recruited into rebel groups, and whether communities feel that they have opportunities to create livelihoods in other ways or not.
Exactly. And a matter of fact, there's another dimension. I spoke to the then Home Secretary in the UK, Tam Priti Patel, about this when we met at one of the dinner. I was saying that the Congo situation is directly impact the US and the UK economy, but the US and the UK security. How? On the eastern part of, let me backtrack a little bit. Congo is traditionally a Christian country. On the eastern part of the country, you've got a solid Islamization of the country. And you've got a branch of ISIS taking roots in that instability. Now, that region is rich in critical minerals. Those minerals can find themselves in the wrong hands. Only God knows what can come back and hit us coming from that conflict.
Hasn't Uganda been providing support against Islamic violent extremism? But it's complicated as well, right?
Yes, that's correct. It's complicated because Uganda is quite close with Rwanda. And Uganda was involved in the first war in looting the minerals from Congo. And when you think about it, the very first city that fell as part of the M23 entrance was Bunagana, and that's bordering with Uganda. So the back base was from Uganda, unfortunately.
Yeah, and Burundi, just tell us how Burundi is involved at the moment.
Burundi is aligned with the DRC. I think the DRC president has a very good relationship with the president of Burundi. The Burundi's troops are in part in the country. But at the same time, Burundi and Rwanda have a frosty relationship, and there's a risk of a war between Burundi and Rwanda in Congo if the M23 keep progressing. So I know there are some talks between Burundi and Rwanda to try to avoid that scenario to be seen. But the Burundi support for Congo at the moment is quite critical.
And it's been useful during this conversation to understand how many different countries are involved in different ways, isn't it? And that's because of the importance of DRC on the continent. And I even saw that DRC has asked Chad for support,
yes.
For example, known on the continent as having a very organised and effective military. And so you really see the solutions, many parts of the continent engaging in trying to find a solution to this conflict.
Yeah, that's correct.
I just wanted to ask very briefly, just that personal take. You're obviously part of the DRC diaspora, and I know that in many places in France, in the UK, the diaspora community has been really vocal trying to raise these issues. You've been very good there at painting it in the way that a geopolitical expert would explain things. And I just wondered how it feels as being part of the diaspora community as you look at what's happening.
That's a very good question. As a matter of fact, personally, I'm very there's a duality here. As I said, I came to this country, I was, 20, 21. I'm turning 50 this year. So though most of my adult life has been lived in the UK, most of my, professional life is in the UK. As I said, I've got my management consultancy firm. We provide geostrategic advisory. And as of today, I've been offered a fellowship place at the Critical Mineral Forum at Cambridge University.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for MENAF, looking at, as a matter of fact, looking at North Africa and Middle East connection. So all of that is all intertwined. Why this is difficult for me? I engage with various ministers and MPs, and my office or our office is 100 meters or 200 meters next to the House of Commons. So I constantly voice and lobby, advocate for the DRC. For the last couple of years, we've been in government for 15 years, and the last couple of years, our conservative government has been supporting Rwanda with the migration deal. I've been raising flags and raising alarms that is a wrong thing to do as a country. But then I got to love the UK. UK is my home and is my country. And UK is siding the wrong person or the wrong country to attack Congo, who is also my country. So that's very conflicting. On the other side, on the Congolese side, one is saying UK is not our friends. We don't want to talk to them about that issue until it's resolved. So that puts me particularly in a very difficult position, trying to make both parties understand. And that's what part of my work is. But I'm using the critical mineral as an angle to achieve that. When I speak to other Congolese in the communities, it's very difficult. It's very difficult. So there is some light, I'd say, given the Labour stance on Rwanda. The Labour Party cut the bilateral aid. We're trying to engage with as many people as possible for them to do a little bit more, because I think it's not enough is being done by the Labour government as well. I think they need to do more. And whenever I do an analysis on the media, I keep talking about that.
Thank you. I'm so glad you've just shined that spotlight, particularly on the UK DRC relationship. And that it was one of the questions I was going to ask. It's always like this with the international community, that the positions, they are important. They are important and they affect regional relationships. It's difficult, but it matters, and it matters right now that UK parliamentarians do understand this conflict and are engaging as it develops in the small part that the international community plays as the region itself looks for solutions.
But if I may, the UK has a unique role to play in this crisis. And I don't think it's playing their hands very well, And let me explain to you why. Rwanda has clearly been identified as the aggressor, backing M23 rebel. It's all on the UN Security Council reports, expert report, all of those evidence are there. But Rwanda is a member of the Commonwealth. So what Rwanda is doing is putting the Commonwealth in disrepute. So with the UK's position within the Commonwealth, they need to leverage that to ask Rwanda to behave really and pull out. The UK government has a unique opportunity to put a hand to this conflict, which it helped create. I'm not going to say who, but when I speak to some of the ministers or MPs, one of the questions I ask is this: how do we know that the million of pounds of taxpayers' money that we send to Rwanda, considering that no refugee has been sent to Rwanda, has not been used to fuel the M23 rebellion? How do we know? So an investigation needs to take place. So that's one. But two, the UK has been one of the biggest aid donor to the DRC. But from a trade perspective, there's a trade imbalance. The UK doesn't trade with, is less than 1 billion. I think it's about 200 million or so. We don't trade. Yet, the UK has a critical mineral strategy. The UK needs agricultural products because we don't grow as many stuff as possible. The UK should get into a trade agreement with the DRC. Now, again, the conservative government, and that's where I was very conflicted, decided to, as you know the trade envoy program, which is there to promote trade between different regions and countries. When you look at the trade envoy for the last government, the trade envoy for the prime minister was a gentleman called Lord Popat. He was in charge of Rwanda, Uganda, and the DRC. Yet those countries are at war. So that shows you the misunderstanding of the huge opportunity DRC has, because when the trade envoy goes to Kinshasa, it will be seen with apprehension. So the UK should seize the opportunity, particularly in critical mineral, particularly in airspace control and airline, particularly in infrastructure and services, because we are good at it, but we're not. And that's where the Labour government could play a difference. And that's my message to them.
Thank you. That's incredibly useful. And I think whenever our country is interfacing with conflict, it's always important at the same time to be looking, yes, our instability makes it more difficult, but DRC is such a large country, looking at the opportunities with the private sector, with trade, with encouraging industry and growth and win-win situations that allow that are forward-looking, because in the end, those things make a difference.
Exactly.
We're coming into land, but I know that you also comment in general across Africa, and your company looks at geopolitical strategy and advice. And I just wondered if you'd tell us the other things that you're looking at on the continent in 2025. And I know that's a big question to end with, so maybe just some highlights.
No, it's a very good question. What I'm looking at is the adoption of new technology. You got AI and blockchain, and people are talking about crypto and all the rest of it. Africa Congo has a very young population. Africa in general, most of the population is young, yet booming. By 2050, the active population in Africa will be much more larger than the West, I would say. So it's a market that one has to watch. Demographic growth. What I'm watching is how that demographic growth is managed, because it's an opportunity and a threat. You may end up with a massive workforce who have access to technology, who can develop applications that can be used in the West, perhaps, that can play the role of what China did by providing cheap labor. In this case, it's not only cheap hand labor, but labor based on new technology, or that youth population growth left uneducated. Because then with that education, with that job opportunities, with that being able to plug themselves into the global market, it potentially can create chaos. So the management of that is quite critical. Everybody is talking about the energy transition and the role that African country can play, is how that side of things will play out. And obviously the local beneficiation. As I said, I'm on the advisory board of a company, setting up the first copper and cobalt refinery in the DRC. I'd like to see more of that happening on the continent. I'm glad to see Alito Dangote with his 20 billion oil refinery, although very painful, but he set that up. We need more of that, because the trend in Africa is about local beneficiation, adding value in the continent for the intra-Africa trades and African and other party trades. So that's what I'm looking for. And lastly, perhaps, is the artisanal mining sector formalization across the continent. Most of the West, I remember, maybe that's the last story I'll say. I was at the BMW leadership team in Germany, and we're talking about access to critical minerals. And one of the things they were saying is we would like to get the cobalt from your country directly. But we can't, because the last thing we want is to see a young kid with a T-shirt with our logo on it. It will look bad on us. So that sector needs to be formalized, because the more it's formalized, the more big companies like us can come and trade directly with you guys. But right now, the off-taking is done by proxy companies who don't always look at the ethical aspect, because there are millions and millions across Africa who are mining artisanally, but that can be professionalized.
That's a great ending. Thank you. Thank you, Guy. Really appreciate your conversation and your insights. If people want to follow you or read more from you, how can they do that?
That's a very good question. I'm on Twitter at GK6. That's my Twitter handle. I'm on LinkedIn as Guy Kioni, GUY, and as well on our website, www.missang is MISSANG.com. And we will be happy to engage.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Guy. Thank you for your time and your insights.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Great British Foreign Affairs Podcast, where Britain meets the world. Subscribe today, share it with a friend or colleague, and be part of shaping Britain's role on the global stage.